The International Court of Justice in The Hague has begun hearing accusations of genocide brought against Israel by South Africa. And the case could take years. But today, South Africa has been asking the court to order Israel to immediately halt its military operations in Gaza. The hearings this week will focus on that request for emergency measures to be imposed much sooner. South Africa has long supported the Palestinians, linking their struggle to its own history of fighting apartheid. Israel, for its part, has strongly denied the claims, calling the accusations baseless.
Israel says it is doing all it can to avoid civilian casualties in Gaza, as it responds to Hamas's terrorist attack last October. But South Africa alleges not only is this untrue, but that Israel's campaign is targeting Palestinians, with the aim of wiping them out as a people. In its more than 80-page filing to the World Court in The Hague, South Africa argues acts and omissions by Israel are genocidal in character, as they are committed with the requisite specific intent to destroy Palestinians in Gaza as part of the broader Palestinian national, racial and ethnical group. It goes on to say this constitutes a breach by Israel of its obligations under the Genocide Convention, a document drawn up in 1948 in the aftermath of the Holocaust, which both Israel and South Africa have signed. Israel, though, says it has a right to self-defence after the bloodiest attack in its history. Its officials have reacted with anger to South Africa's filing, pointing out that Hamas continues to call for the destruction of the Jewish state. Israel says it will fight back in the court.
The State of Israel will appear before the International Court of Justice at The Hague to dispel South Africa's absurd blood libel. How tragic that the rainbow nation that prides itself on fighting racism will be fighting pro bono for anti-Jewish racists.
Palestinians in Gaza and the rest of the world will be looking closely at the court's response to South Africa's request. A provisional ruling could come within weeks, but any final judgment is expected to take years.
And I'd like to get into the details with Kathleen Powell, Associate Professor of Law at the University of Cape Town. She's an expert on international organizations and the interface between law and politics in the international arena. Perfect person to speak to about this. Now, I understand that you have been following proceedings in The Hague today. Do you think that South Africa has a convincing case here?
Good afternoon. Yes, I have been following the proceedings, and I also read the 84-page application that South Africa sent in advance, and I think it makes an extremely strong case. And certainly the legal argument this morning was superb. Each member of a very impressive legal team dealt with each aspect that had to be proven before South Africa can get provisional measures indicated against Israel. And in fact, it's also asked for some provisional measures against itself to stop the military onslaught in Gaza, to preserve evidence, and to ensure that Gazans are given the ability to survive, in that food, water, electricity gets restored, and that medical help and humanitarian aid is available.
Let's speak a little bit more first then about these provisional measures. I understand the ICJ is expected to decide within weeks, including whether there will be an emergency suspension of Israel's campaign in Gaza. What will the court be basing its decision on?
Well, there are four things that the applicant states that South Africa has to prove in order to get provisional measures. One is that the court has a prima facie case of jurisdiction. So not whether it has jurisdiction per se, that is a decision that gets taken later on when the merits of the case get considered, but just that there's a plausible case that's been made for jurisdiction. That's quite easy in this case because both South Africa and Israel are parties to the Genocide Convention, which gives the ICJ jurisdiction if there are disputes about whether a state is responsible for genocide. So that's quite easy. then South Africa has to show that it has a right to bring the case, and it's done this on the basis that it's a party to the Genocide Convention and that it has an obligation under the Genocide Convention to prevent genocide, not just not to commit it. And it relies there on the case of Gambia versus Myanmar, where the ICJ allowed an African state to bring a genocide case against a state on another continent. So that's its second hurdle that it had to meet. Then it had to show that the subject matter of its complaint relates to the Genocide Convention. And it did this by giving a brief overview of the facts, both the genocidal acts that it's complaining of, so the destruction of most of Gaza, and the displacement of 85% of its population, and then a separate section on genocidal intent, where it quoted members of the Israeli government, members of the Knesset, people connected to the military, making statements such as wipe Gaza off the map. If you have an Arab neighbor, go shoot him now. So then there was a section showing that
I just want to jump in there because that does speak to the wider case, doesn't it? These allegations of genocidal intent. Yes. You said they're going to be looking at statements from Israeli politicians. How else will they try to make their case here?
I think that the case is going to turn on genocidal intent because Israel has already argued that it's acting in self-defense, and you mentioned that in your introduction to this discussion. And although that is a difficult call to make, given how disproportionate the damage has been in Gaza, that has been the strongest case that Israel has made so far. But if, and this is what one of the counsel pointed out this morning in the case before The Hague, if the intention behind all the destruction is not to defend Israel, but to destroy a people in whole or in part, then you've got genocide. So I think a lot of the case is going to center on genocidal intent. That's all you need for genocide. You need the acts and you need the intention. But the intention is very specific. And bear in mind that the intention's got to be to destroy a group in whole or in part, and that group's got to be defined as national, racial, ethnical, or religious.
And so just quickly, before I let you go, I'm sorry to jump in because we're just running out of time, but I'm curious if you could, before we move on, how would you rate their chances of success in proving this?
I think they're very good at getting provisional measures. And the arguments this morning made clear that the court has granted provisional measures when the prejudice that was being threatened, the harm to human beings was a lot less than what we're dealing with now. So I was explaining earlier on what the requirements for provisional measures are. The fourth one is prejudice. And it's clear from the precedent, from what the ICJ has done in the past, that it's prepared to issue provisional measures when there's a risk of prejudice. And in this particular case, you've got the prejudice already happening and ongoing. So I think the chances are good. Whatever arguments Israel brings tomorrow may have a bearing on the merits of the case, which gets considered later. But on whether you're going to have provisional measures or not, I think it's unlikely that Israel can prevent them.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. I'm afraid that's all we have time for now. That's Kathleen Powell, Associate Professor of Law at the University of Cape Town. And let's get the view from Israel with DW's correspondent Rebecca Ritters in Jerusalem. Rebecca, tell us more about Israel's reaction to South Africa's claims at the UN's top court today.
Well, Israel's obviously going to get its day in court tomorrow, Claire, as we've been hearing, to defend the allegations put against it. And these are allegations that Israel vehemently denies and have vehemently denied all across the board the whole way along. Israel insists that it's acting in self-defence against what it says are genocidal acts by Hamas carried out on October 7 and in the following days. It insists, it maintains that it is doing everything that it can to prevent civilians civilian casualties, and in fact blames Hamas for the high death toll, saying that the group are using civilians as human shields. Now, just before South Africa took the stand, we heard from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He took to X, formerly Twitter, to basically reiterate those claims, saying that Israel has no desire to reoccupy Gaza, that it has been acting within international law. He didn't mention the ICJ ruling directly, but it was a very significantly timed statement. In the aftermath, we haven't heard any specific statements from Israel, but we know that Israel have called South Africa criminally complicit with Hamas, and they're saying that they're basically the legal arm of Hamas. So, some very strong statements coming from Israel, very clear what their point of view is. Now, it's going to be very interesting to hear just what the defence has to say tomorrow, given, as you just heard there, the very strong case put forward by South Africa.
And looking even a little bit further ahead, we've heard that South Africa is asking the court to impose these binding preliminary orders on Israel, including a halt to its operations in Gaza. How likely do you think Israel would be to abide by the ICJ's decision?
That's really, really difficult to predict, Claire. ICJ rulings are legally binding, but they're very, very difficult to enforce. They can be ignored. And we saw that with Russia in the case in 2022, when the ICJ ruling was for Russia to cease hostilities in Ukraine. Now, that ruling and the fact that Russia ignored it showed some of the weaknesses of the ICJ. And it's for that reason that some experts are saying that the ICJ may this time not take it to that length. It may not go all the way calling for a full cessation of hostilities, that it may give a more nuanced approach or a more nuanced ruling calling for more aid to be led into Gaza, for Israel to hold up its obligations and that kind of thing. Now, if that's the ruling, we may well see Israel comply by it. But if the ruling is that Israel has to completely cease hostilities, it's very likely that Israel could ignore that. But it's just too soon to say.
Rebecca, thank you so much for that update. That's Rebecca Ritters for us in Jerusalem. And Germany's economy minister and vice chancellor Robert Habeck is on a trip to Israel, where he hit back against the genocide charges that have been brought by South Africa.
My personal and political opinion is that one can criticise the Israeli military for using harsh measures in the Gaza Strip. However, that does not constitute genocide. Those who would commit genocide or desire to do so, if given the opportunity, are Hamas. The annihilation of the State of Israel is on their agenda. So we can understand the slogan "From the river to the sea" as not meaning that Jews should leave Israel by boat, but as an extinction fantasy. Accusing Israel of genocide is a complete distortion of victims and perpetrators, in my view, and it is just wrong.
And Germany's economy minister and vice chancellor Robert Habeck is on a trip to Israel, where he hit back against the genocide charges that have been brought by South Africa.
My personal and political opinion is that one can criticise the Israeli military for using harsh measures in the Gaza Strip. However, that does not constitute genocide. Those who would commit genocide or desire to do so, if given the opportunity, are Hamas. The annihilation of the State of Israel is on their agenda. So we can understand the slogan "From the river to the sea" as not meaning that Jews should leave Israel by boat, but as an extinction fantasy. Accusing Israel of genocide is a complete distortion of victims and perpetrators, in my view, and it is just wrong.